You know what the most dangerous thing in America is, right? Nigga with a library card.
This is the Most Dangerous Thing in America podcast, a show in which we read books by black authors and they're talked about by a black author. And you can listen if you are black or not black. That is okay. I'm in a good mood. I've had a long day, but I'm in a good mood because I was getting ready for this podcast. I clicked on a video of Biggie versus Supreme, which we'll get to. And it's hilarious. It's a trailer on YouTube, but the production value is so bad. Kind of reminded me of Smack DVDs, but more ridiculous. It's good. It's very good. We'll get to it in a moment. This week on the podcast, I'm reading, it's a very funny video. I'm reading Justin Tinsley's It Was All a Dream, Biggie and the World That Made Him. I originally wrote down that title last night as Biggie and the Streets That Made Him, and I liked it. And I was going to purposely mess up right now. But instead, I just told the truth. Perhaps it would have been better to lie. Anyway, this is a nonfiction biography of Big. I recently read Jonathan Abrams' Oral History of Hip Hop. And I've been meaning to read this Justin Tinsley book for a year, because it's been out for about a year, but I couldn't get a hard copy. Then I came to America, back in America, and I was looking around for a hard copy and went to Barnes & Noble, and they didn't have it. My local library didn't have it, so I finally bought one off of Amazon, and they still haven't sent it to me, so I had to get the ebook of this. Point being, it's been a long odyssey for this book, and it's a long book, and I'm really tired of ebooks, so I read the first 7 chapters, and this is going to be a 3-part podcast, what I usually do with nonfiction books. I like to split it up. A lot of information in nonfiction books in general, so this is going to be a 3-part podcast. The first 7 chapters are being read from an ebook, and the last 16 chapters will be read from a physical book, if that matters. Maybe you will notice this first podcast I'm a bit off. My game isn't not on my A game, but by the time we get to the back 16, I'm going to be firing with both cylinders, so don't worry about that. Okay, so It Was All a Dream, Biggie and the World That Made Him. Of course, we have to start with the preface of what more can we say about Biggie? Well, that's the thing about Justin Tinsley. He says the very same thing in his introduction, and he knows that Biggie's a tough subject to cover because we have been, I feel like if you were born a millennial black person who was into hip hop, so that's going to be a large swath of black people who are millennials, Tupac and Biggie really are the cultural figures. It would be weird to say that they are Malcolm and Martin, but in a way, you know what I mean? Just occupying that level of space in your head. Not that they were doing the same things necessarily, but just occupying the same level of space in your head, because otherwise who would it have been? Trying to think of who our great black leaders have been in my lifetime, and you'd have to go with, Sharpton, Jackson, and then of course Obama. I don't know that any of those 3 are standing up to Malcolm and Martin. So instead, we go with the pop culture figures of Biggie and Tupac, who have been occupying this space for 30 plus years in our heads since their deaths, 27 years ago, just about. So everything's been said about Biggie, and I've actually skipped a ton of it because I was so, the documentary Unbelievable, which Tinsley talks about, the movie, which Tinsley references, his mother, Voletta Wallace's biography. I skipped it because I was there as this happened. So I figured I knew everything there was to know about Biggie. Now, I do not know everything there is to know about Biggie. And there are some things in this book that I didn't know that I'll point out in just a moment. But in order for Tinsley to deal with this problem of perhaps just rehashing old territory, he opens the book with a thesis. He says, in this book, we'll connect the dots that trace back to the 1960s and 70s and we'll connect the dots that trace back to the 1960s and 70s and how legislation, systemic racism, and America's evolving fear of the black body transformed a generation's worth of lives. And I have to say, just as an immediate evaluation of the book, he makes good on that promise. He talks about a lot of things that factor into how Biggie became Biggie that have nothing to do with Biggie in the way that we think of something having to do with our individualized persons, right? So he talks about the crack epidemic. He talks about waves of immigration. He talks about the war on drugs, and he does frame it a lot. That being said, he doesn't over or underdo it. I think it's balanced just right, because when you're coming to this book, you really do just want to read about Big. If I wanted to read a book that was going to contextualize all of the Black experience, let's just say the millennial Black experience, and a little bit older, the Gen X/millennial Black experience. And as I say that out of my mouth, whenever I hear Gen X, I just think of white people. I wonder how many Black people call themselves Gen Xers. For millennials, I think it's a bit different. And there's probably something there, something to ruminate on a bit more. Perhaps I'll ruminate on it at a different time. But at any rate, if you wanted to read a book that was just about that, you'd go pick that up. But you don't really want that. What you want is a book about Biggie with a bit of contextualizing on the edges, just enough so you understand, well, where did his mother come from, and what neighborhood was he living in, and what was going on at the time, and why were there so many people doing this, and what policies led to that. And Tinsley does a great job of giving us just enough of that information, which, again, I feel like if you're my age and Black, you already know all of this stuff, right? It was in the music. That's the other thing, too, about hip-hop, is that if you were a hip-hop head and you were really paying attention, you got schooled by all hip-hop. Doesn't have to be, as I've said many times before, it doesn't have to be Dead Prez and, name your conscious rapper here. It's in regular gangster hip, NWA songs will school you about what's going on in the hood, or if you're not from the hood, like myself, in Black America, or just in being Black in America in general. So if you are Black and reading this book, I would imagine, and you're of age, of my age, of a certain age, I would imagine that what Tinsley is laying out is all very familiar. If you're younger, okay, maybe not, but probably still, even then, if you're Black, because, again, it's still in the music, and you still got fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, aunts, etc., schooling you about what it is. So anyway, enjoy the contextualization. It's not too much. We do get mostly Big. All right, now let's hop into the book itself. I'm not going to go chapter by chapter. I'll go section by section. So the first 7 chapters cover Big from conception until basically he meets Puff Daddy. He hasn't met Puff Daddy when I finished, but Puff Daddy has entered the book. Puff Daddy also has an origin chapter. We get to meet the kid who became the Puff. That doesn't work. So anyway, that's the first third of the book. I imagine the second third is the rise, and the third is the final third is probably, I don't know if you could call it a fall. He didn't really have a fall, but maybe the aftermath. So perhaps life after death. Bit on the nose. Okay. So anyway, instead of going through chapter to chapter, I'll just hit some broad points. Basically, Big's mother, Valletta Wallace, met a dude, and they conceived Big, and then the guy turned out to be married, so he's no good. And then so his mother was super dedicated to Biggie her whole life, and she lived for Big and worked so hard and all of that. And Biggie wasn't Biggie, growing up. He was Christopher Wallace, a very smart kid, bright kid, affable, loved to be on the stoop, liked the neighborhood and neighborhood peeps. And there was a local jazz musician, Donald Harrison, who he befriended and learned about music about and stuff. And all of that was cool. And then he basically hit his teenage years and was like, oh, I can make more money selling crack. And even though my mom does all this stuff for me, I would make more money selling crack. So that's, basically what happens in the first 7 chapters. Now, what I would like to do is talk about what I didn't know, what I liked, and some author stuff. So that's basically it. And really, basically, I'm just going to be talking about what I didn't know. The what I like section is very short, probably just going to be that YouTube video. So here's what I didn't know. Big was a first-generation American. this is crazy to me. Because I think somewhere, I did know maybe possibly, perhaps that Big's mother was Jamaican. Okay, maybe I knew that. I would have just dismissed it anyway. I'd have been like, oh, she's from New York or whatever. It doesn't hit the same because the Jamaican New York connection is so strong. I barely even think of it as as an immigration thing. Although I should, obviously. But then on top of that, his father was also a Jamaican expat. So two things. One, immigrants in hip hop, it's hardly ever talked about really, or at least when I was growing up, certainly wasn't emphasized. And it was definitely a very closed thing. Hip hop was for Black Americans specifically. It is interesting in the last week or so, what with Emmanuel Acho and Van Lathan getting into an argument, to hear this conversation that's been bubbling up over the last couple of years about the difference between, let's say, ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves, and then Black immigrants who are either African or from the Caribbean. It is interesting to think that Biggie actually straddles both of those sides of the conversation, and I would have never, ever even thought about that, ever. And so that's one thing that's interesting about it. And then the second thing that's interesting is that Biggie is yet another Jamaican. And I don't mean yet another Jamaican in the sense that we have a lot of Jamaicans or something. I mean, he's yet another Jamaican that contributed to hip-hop culture, and not just contributed, shaped it. In the last podcast where we were talking about Jonathan Abrams' book, The Oral History of Hip Hop, to come up, Jonathan Abrams and the people he's interviewing are talking about, I don't know if they were explicitly talking about the fact that Jamaica had this outsized importance in hip hop, but they were talking about the fact that people were Jamaican, whatever, it doesn't matter. The point being, there are a ton of Jamaicans who contributed to hip hop, one, so that just, okay, that statement, okay. But then the Jamaicans who did contribute to hip hop, it's not like they're just like, oh, they were kind of hanging out, and they're Jamaican. They massively contributed to hip hop. So I'll just read this little section that Tinsley wrote here on page 16. People from all over the world were flocking to the Big Apple for many of the same reasons Valletta came. Everyone yearned for freedom, whether financial, religious, or personal, and by and large, New York embodied all of that, from the outside looking in at least. It was only once they arrived in America that these immigrants came to understand how much of a rat race it was. This is why many of rap's first generation of stars and influential names were in fact first generation Americans themselves. Kool Herc, born in Jamaica, and then Africa Bambaataa, born in the Bronx to immigrants from Jamaica and Barbados. Grandmaster Flash, born in Barbados. Slick Rick, born in England to Jamaican parents. And then Shabba Ranks, whatever, that's fine. But Kool Herc is the massive, massive one. Bambaataa is also, and then Flash is Barbados. But I just want to focus on Jamaica. Kool Herc, Bambaataa, and Biggie. You're not going to get a better. I mean, that's crazy. So I just think hip-hop's debt to Jamaica can't be overstated. Obviously, it's the whole diaspora in conjunction. It's Africans of the blood, Africans of the soil, and it's a rhythm moving throughout the world, and it's bigger than just America. It's bigger than just New York, but New York is where it happened. I'll still stand on that New York is where it's happened, and that American hip-hop, even if it's created by immigrants, that doesn't make it less American. That makes it more American, right? Things created by immigrants are the most American thing. So to me, hip-hop is still American, like jazz and, blues and all of that. But it should just be noted that, it is created by immigrants with others too. There were also other Americans who were non-immigrants or second generation or whatever, what have you, involved. But I just feel like it's never been, really hammered into my head until these last couple of books I've been reading. I knew Kool Herc was Jamaican, I'm pretty sure. Maybe now I'm just retroactively saying that. But I never knew that Biggie was Jamaican. That's just so massive. That's just such a big thing. And his name's Biggie, and it's a big thing. Anyway, I thought it was a huge deal. And then one other just note on the Jamaican thing. he was talking about how Biggie felt comfortable battling. And he said, these sorts of moments, this is Tinsley, these sorts of moments had been part of his bloodline from watching his Uncle Dave toasting and chatting on the mic, in quotation marks, chatting on the mic in Jamaica. Big's cocky yet suave demeanor with the mic was all but a family heirloom. There's a couple of different things I thought that were interesting about this. One is that people always talk about the oral tradition in African American culture, African culture, Black culture. And, sometimes I think it can be a little overstated by people who aren't in the culture. But by people who are in the culture, I'm fine with it. Of course, it's like a lot of things that are said about Black people. But at any rate, this is just a really interesting idea that Big was in Jamaica watching his uncle, talk on the mic in that setting, and then coming back and just being like, oh, I know how to talk shit. One, raised in Brooklyn, so, okay, there's that. But two, I've been back in Jamaica, too. And then the other thing that's interesting, also just the phrase itself, chatting on the mic, very good. Love Jamaican phrases. That's very good. The other thing about it is that it's interesting, and there's a couple of things like this that interested me here. One was that, this is a good transition. One is that Big was going to Jamaica. So, when you're growing up poor, and so I want to be clear here. This is about being poor. This is not about being from Bed-Stuy. This is not about being from the projects. This is about being poor. Because you can be poor anywhere. To be poor, but to be able to go abroad and visit family is an interesting thing. So you just flat out, there's a couple of things at play here. One is that he was a only child. So that gives you more money to do stuff, right? You have more wiggle room. I'm saying this as a person who grew up with 3 siblings and didn't get on an airplane until I was 21. And because getting on an airplane is expensive. Leaving the country is expensive. Now, once you get to that country, you got family you stay with, and that country, the dollar converts nicely. Okay, fine. I get it. But still. So that's an interesting thing. And the other interesting thing was that Biggie didn't have to be out in the streets because his mother worked so hard. She gave him everything. Over and over again, the book talks about how he had all these video games and all of this and all of that. And so he didn't have to be selling crack. But the problem was that from his vantage point where he grew up, he saw other people out there, and they were, as many hip hop songs would tell you, they were the rock stars, right? They had the money, they were flashing the cash. Not just like, oh, that's pretty good money. He's got a nice solid job. He's got you're talking about $5,000 a week. You see somebody making $5,000 a week and you compare that with an allowance from your mom and video games, it's really not the same thing, So there is that aspect. But I think Tinsley does a good point of pointing out that he didn't have to be out there in them streets, and he chose to be out there in those streets, and he made it work for him, but he didn't have to be. And it's just an interesting thing to think about too with the flights to Jamaica thing. What blows my mind about it is the concept of getting out of the hood for some people is so difficult to wrap their head around that, they can't even, they don't, it just doesn't even happen, And the same thing is true for people who aren't from, the projects or something like that. If you just don't have money, it's just hard to imagine traveling, And Biggie got to travel early on in life, and he had an opportunity he was smart, and he had an opportunity to stay out of the streets, but he got into those streets. And so I don't know. I just thought it was interesting. It's also kind of similar to Tupac. When I was growing up, I'd always assumed Tupac was just there's that Del the Funky Homo Sapien song, Super Fiend. I always imagined Pac was like super thug. But he really wasn't. He went to a performing arts high school. Obviously, his mother was a Black Panther. She's mentioned in the book, too, because their legacies are linked. And so Pac didn't also have to be I don't actually remember Pac's financial situation, but I do remember the anecdote, and I didn't look this up, but my friend told me way back when, and I believe it's true, that Pac was trying to sell drugs, and he was so bad at it, they were just like, you don't even know how to do this correctly. So it's just interesting to think about, like, two guys who didn't have to be in the streets. With Biggie, his mother was taking care of him, and she was providing for him, but he wanted more, so he got out on the streets. With Pac, he's this great performer and artist, and then he just came to embody this thing that I don't think exactly was him. You know, it's like almost like he became his character in Juice, but he wasn't his character. But anyway, this isn't a Tupac biography. Oh, but so the reason I brought all this up was that on page 37, there's just a funny thing that happened, and it's in the documentary Bigger Than Life. And what happens is that Biggie lost a ounce or something or whatever. So somehow he messed up some kind of drug thing, and his mother came in and paid off the drug dealer for him. And this is in the documentary. And that's just kind of funny in a way. Like, I don't think that's what usually happens. I don't think your mother usually comes and pays off to connect, but unless it's a family business. Anyway, those are things I didn't know. I didn't realize that about Biggie. I knew that, I mean, obviously his mother's been very vocal since he died, and kind of before. So I knew that his mother was always in his life, but I didn't know the extent to which, he kind of, well, one, didn't know he was first generation American. Two, didn't know that he was able to travel a bit as a kid. And then three, I didn't know that he really didn't have to be in those streets. Again, I guess in a way nobody has to be in the streets, but like in his situation in particular, he really didn't have to. But the lure of the streets was there. And I think Tinsley does a good job talking about it. And we'll get to that in a bit, because I just want to talk about one more thing that I did not know, and that's the nomenclature. I had no idea that BIG stood for business instead of game. I feel like that's a backronym. Definitely never heard that before. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention. Is it on any songs on Ready to Die or Life After Death? Because if it is, I don't remember that lyric. And I've definitely listened to both those albums within the last month. So I don't know. And then the second one is on page 42 in the book, the origin story of the name Biggie Smalls. So one night, Zaquel and Chris were watching the 1975 film Let's Do It Again, starring Bill Cosby, Sidney Poitier, Ossie Davis, John Amos, Calvin Lockhart, Jimmy Walker, and more. And then there's a character named Biggie Smalls. This was also in the oral history book by Jonathan Abrams, but I just wanted to highlight it again because it's like once you learn something, it just pops up everywhere. Probably today when I'm walking around, somebody will go, "Did you know that the name Biggie Smalls comes from a blaxploitation film from 1975?" And I'll get to say, yes, I did. All right, so that's what I didn't know, and then what I liked we'll get to in a second. But first, what I don't like. There's a fucking helicopter that I guess is trying to land on top of this office building. I mean, I've been trying to wait, and it's like, what's going on, Get a real Henry Hill situation going on here. Anyway, what I did like in the book was everything pretty much, I don't really have any specific things other than the thing that I was laughing about off top, which was as Big transitions from crack to music, there's a little, a few stories here or there about how he came and the demos he's making, and he meets Big Daddy Kane's DJ and things like that. But one of the better anecdotes is when he meets Supreme and they freestyle, or they battle in front of like a bodega or something. Maybe I'm just saying that because it's New York. It's probably like a barbershop. I don't know. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The guy's name is Supreme. And I was reading it going like, this guy has probably gas the situation up, like really. There's a quote that he says that let me know like, oh, this dude is taking this too seriously. And so I immediately had to Google it. I'm saying Google weird. Google it. Anyway, so I immediately Googled it, And then I kept it open today, and I was going to close the tab out. I'm very big on tab maintenance. I don't like too many tabs open, so I was going to close the tab out. And then I was like, you know what? Let me just click on one. Let me just click on one. And I will put the one I clicked on in the show notes and just watch it, because it's shameless piggybacking. So there was a trailer produced in 2014. Big's been dead for 18 years, and like, we all want to get into like the granular minutia of every single person we love. How did they become who they were? And do you have any story that nobody's ever heard before? Which I guess is the reason I'm reading this book. And so I'd never heard this story before, but having watched the 2-minute documentary, or excuse me, the 2-minute trailer for the documentary, I feel safe in saying that reading a like paragraph about it in this book is as much as you need. You definitely do not need to watch the entire documentary, but judge for yourself. It's in the show notes. So if you would like to watch Notorious B.I.G. vs. Supreme, the documentary, I assume there's a link somewhere on the YouTube page. But yeah, check out the trailer in the show notes. Very enjoyable stuff. And then the last thing is about the author. So yeah, I really have enjoyed it, and I thought that he did a good job of adding context. Like I said, I thought he did a good job of explaining exactly who Biggie was in ways that we didn't know. We being me, maybe you, but the Jamaican aspect, the immigrant aspect, and the by no means affluent, but just a little bit more money than I assumed aspect. And then the thing I think, to piggyback on that, by no means affluent, but a little bit more money than I thought thing, I would like to mention the part where Jamal Tinsley does not absolve him for selling crack. So he says, so I'll just read the whole passage here. He says, Big says, even when I was wrong, I got my point across, he'd rhyme years later. That was his way of solving problems. It wasn't right, but the intention was so pure it was hard to be mad at him. But that ruthless side was always there too. He didn't really stop to think about the destruction selling crack was doing to the community. He was selling to men and women who, for the most part, looked just like him. The consequences of his decisions never took precedence over his own ambitions. He needed the money, not just for himself, but because his supply wasn't free. If the Connect didn't get his money, there would be problems. And that's when we go on to tell the story about how his mom bailed him out. But he didn't absolve him for selling crack. And I guess in general, Tinsley here can be said to be talking to all crack dealers in the black community in general. But I think it hits a little bit harder because, Big really didn't have to be selling crack like that. But he had those ambitions. So, I'm sure living in Bed-Stuy, when he was living in Bed-Stuy, wearing the Catholic uniform that he had to wear, fighting people, getting some money from his mother would have been cool. So it's not like it would have been like, oh, I'm a millionaire, but it was survivable. But instead he chose the streets, which is, it is what it is, I guess, is the cliche term to use here. He did it. It was not right, but given the environment that he was in, it was not uncommon. And it's not unbelievable that he did it, I guess, is the best you can say for it. And I think Tinsley does a good job of saying it that way. Not absolving him, not forgiving him, but contextualizing why he made the decisions he did. And I think it makes sense. So the only other note I have is on page 5. This is also a note about Mr. Tinsley. He says he's naming, there were hit records. So he's talking about different songs in the big canon. So I'm going to actually read this line out of order. There were hit records that became instant smashes. The undeniably addictive remix to One More Chance, or Junior Mafia's Player's Anthem. Got basketball in the mind, playoffs. And then the first song he named was the Socioeconomic Advancement Anthem Juicy. Friends, the Socioeconomic Advancement Anthem Juicy. That's okay. And I guess the next time I watch The Jeffersons, it'll be the Socioeconomic Advancement theme song from The Jeffersons. That is just funny. I just like that. Sometimes a song can just be good. We don't have to attach all the other stuff to it. Juicy's just a good song. but yeah, it is about socioeconomics, I guess. All right. That's going to do it. Short and sweet this week. We're under 30 minutes right now. This never happens. It's not going to be under 30 minutes once we add everything in, But as I'm recording it, looking at my software, it's under 30 minutes, really makes me feel good. So proud of myself, proud of all you for sticking in there. And I'll be back next week with parts 2. I don't know why I pluralized it. I'll be back next week with part 2. And I believe it will be next week, but it might be 2 weeks. So usually it's 2 weeks, but I might try to speed it up a bit and go next week. So yeah, let's commit to that now. Next week, part 2, the next 8 chapters in the book. And yeah, please subscribe on Pocket Casts, iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud. Check out the show notes primarily to watch that YouTube video because it's funny. Follow me on Twitter. I will also, I'm on Instagram and TikTok now, but I've not posted a single picture or video. So Instagram, I'll post a picture of a book or something, right? That's the thing to do. And then on TikTok, I will make the worst TikTok video imaginable, not on purpose, and then I'll post that. So there you go. So you can find that in the show notes. And the music is by TheKeepRunning, also in the show notes. Everything you need is in the show notes. Just check it out. And yeah, it was all a dream for the next 2 episodes. And then after that, I'm potentially going to be interviewing somebody. So look out for the first ever interview on the Most Dangerous Thing in America podcast. But I'll let you know more about that if and when it happens. So, yeah. Until next time, stay safe, stay black, and keep reading.
This time enough at last. That's not fair. That's not fair at all. There was time now. There was all the time I needed. That's not fair. That's not fair.